How were Shakespeare's works pronounced in his own time? Since the publication, in 1869, of Alexander J. Ellis's Early English Pronunciation, many attempts have been made to answer this question. But for the past 20 years, one scholar has been especially foremost in the subject, the linguist David Crystal. He has been called, quote, the guiding linguistic spirit behind the movement known as Original Pronunciation, or OP, an attempt to revive in performance the sound system of Elizabethan English. His work began in 2004, when he served as the linguist for 3 performances in OP of Romeo and Juliet, staged at the Globe Theatre. A full-scale attempt of this kind had not been attempted since the 1950s. And many more performances in OP have followed, along with books, papers, articles, and in 2016, the Oxford Dictionary of Original Shakespearean Pronunciation, which offers a pronunciation for every word in Shakespeare, and which Culpeper calls, quote, one of the most significant works of scholarship to have appeared in recent decades. Crystal has founded his reconstruction, above all, on the basis of rhythms, rhymes, and puns, which he refers to as, quote, the best evidence. Rhymes are particularly favoured by him, which give us the ability, he says, to deduce the value of vowels. He provides an example of his method when he asks, how should we pronounce the last syllable of Rosalind to rhyme with thin or fine? The text makes it clear, he answers, and then he quotes lines from Romeo and Juliet in which Rosaline rhymes with mine. And when it seems inappropriate to adapt to either pronunciation in a pair of rhymes, as in the case of haste and fast, he chooses, quote, a pronunciation midway between the two for both words. But there appear to be a number of potential dangers in this way of going about things. The most obvious one is that of uniting the sounds of imperfect rhymes and mistakenly merging entire lexical sets. Byron, for example, uses many of the same rhymes that Shakespeare does. Love with prove, alone with gone, forth with worth, and so on. But does it follow that Byron had a similar pronunciation with Shakespeare? I rhymes, however, says Crystal, were generally looked down on in Shakespeare's day. We infer this from Daniel. Rhyme, quote, gives to the ear an echo, and read it explicitly in Puttenham, quote, the good maker will not wrench his word to help his rhyme. But to this point I would still object that a good rhyme for an Elizabethan may have been phonetically looser than it is for us. And I would also propose 2 further dangers in Crystal's method. First, that a, quote, midway pronunciation, by which we synthesize words that rhyme, may be mistaken. And secondly, that the same word may have had multiple pronunciations. Fortunately, however, we have no need to rely too much on rhymes. For there is a way for us to gain insight into the speech of Shakespeare's day that is completely independent of them. In 1569, a revolutionary book was published entitled An Orthography. Its author was John Hart, a gentleman who made it his life work to create an entirely phonological system of English spelling. Of my treatise, he says, the end is one: to use as many letters in our writing as we do voices or breaths in speaking, and no more. And never to abuse one for another, and to write as we speak. The reputation of Hart is very high among linguists. For Dobson, quote, Hart deserves to rank with the greatest English phoneticians and authorities on pronunciation. For Fierek, he is, quote, the best phonetician of the 16th century. Jesperson calls him, quote, the first phonetician of the modern period. And Lass refers to his orthography as, quote, a masterpiece. The system of Hart is profoundly simple. He gives 5 letters for 5 vowel sounds and no more. Letter A, letter E, letter I, letter O, and letter U. For the sounds of these vowels, Hart appeals, quote, to all musicians, of what nation soever they be, referring to them also as the vowels of Italian and Spanish. At first blush, then, the letters appear to represent A, E, I, O, and U. Although it is also possible that letter E may represent air, and that letter O may represent O. It is true that Hart also marks what he calls long vowels with a dot underneath the letter, like this. But the quality, he assures us, never changes, only the quantity. For an analogy with modern English, happy and receive have, in the second syllable, the same vowel sound of E. But in happy, the sound is short, happy, while in receive, the sound is long, receive. Taking Hart's system at face value, this difference would be represented by letter I and letter I with a dot underneath. Now, Crystal does make use of Hart, but I do not believe that he makes enough use of him. He refers to writers like Hart as a supplement, instead preferring the chief evidence of spellings and rhymes. But it seems preferable to me that we should use writers like Hart as our chief evidence and rhymes as a supplement. For then we shall avoid the serious problems that inevitably result from relying on rhymes. Now, Hart contradicts the reconstruction of Crystal in a number of important respects, and I will go through these one by one. Words in the price lexical set are, in the OP of Crystal, pronounced oi. Thus, for kind, fire, and desire, he has coined, feuer, desire. He takes this oi sound, presumably, from the works of Kerkeritz, Dobson, and Cercignani. But it has been opposed by a number of other linguists, among them Patricia Wolff and Roger Lass. They reject it first because, in Hart, words in the Price lexical set are almost always written with the digraph ei, as kind, feuer, desire. And secondly, because, from Hart's descriptions of his letters, we can make no credible interpretation of his letter E, but a sound of either or e. Now, to every word in the happy lexical set, the last syllable in words like lovely or city, Crystal also gives a sound of oi, as apoi, luvloi, sitoi, and so on. This is because words in the Price lexical set and words in the happy lexical set often rhyme in Shakespeare. Thus, Crystal observes that in Sonnet 154, by rhymes with remedy. To solve the problem, he provides his oi sound as a midway pronunciation between the two. Boy, remedoi. But his method of harmonizing rhymes has, in my opinion, led him into a mistake. For we learn from Hart that words in the happy lexical set had alternate pronunciations. Very often he writes such words with the letter I, as in modern English. Accordingly, gladly, softly, and so on. While at other times, he writes them with the digraph ei. Thus, Hart has both indifferently and indifferently, commonly and commonly, perfectly and perfectly. So that an Elizabethan, it would seem, could choose to pronounce a word in the happy lexical set with either e or a. The difference between Hart and Crystal can be most strikingly seen in a word like lively, which in Crystal takes a double schwa and is pronounced loivly, but in Hart is given two distinct sounds, lively. To anticipate a possible objection, Hart's letter E cannot, I believe, represent a schwa in his digraph ei, as Crystal implies in a 2013 blog post. This would defy Hart's explanations of the letter's pronunciation. That it is the E of Romance languages like Italian and Spanish, or that we sound it by, quote, thrusting the inner part of the tongue to the inner and upper great teeth. It is true that a single letter E, when unstressed, might plausibly be taken to stand at times for a schwa, but it is unthinkable that it should do so in a diphthong, leave alone one that appears everywhere in stress positions. Another objection may be that it is unfair to draw conclusions only from Hart. And it is at this point that I wish to introduce another writer into my argument. In 1621, there was another attempt to make a phonetic system of English, in a book called Logonomia Antica. The author was Alexander Gill, the master of St. Paul's School and the teacher of Milton. The attempt was not, says Jesperson, as faithful as that of Hart. Jesperson going so far as to call it, quote, simply a reformed spelling with a leaning towards phoneticism. But surely enough, we find that Gill also spells words in the happy lexical set in alternate ways. Thus we have mercy, beauty, pity, etc., spelled with a letter I. But, on the other hand, some are spelled with the letter J. Thus we have lovely, Luvlj, infamy, Infamj, ugly, Uglj, etc. And for greatly, Gretli and Gretlj show again that the same word in this set could take an alternate pronunciation. What is the value of Gill's letter J? It is not certain. If we are to assign a value to it, then I agree with Wolf, who makes it A, and supposes that by the graphemes EI and J, Gill was distinguishing between the sounds A and A. But what I do at any rate observe is that among dozens of extracts that Gill makes from the poets, letter I and letter J never rhyme. And this circumstance directly contradicts the supposition of Crystal that words in the happy lexical set always took one sound. There is another indication that a distinction between letter I and letter J was strongly felt. I, for the happy lexical set, is generally pretty common in Gill, but in his extracts from the Bible, such words most frequently take a J. It would seem, then, that J was felt to represent a more solemn or formal sound than I. Another place where Hart disagrees with the reconstruction of Crystal is in the choice lexical set, with diphthong oi, as in voice. Crystal proposes a schwa for these words also. Thus he has choice, voice. But Hart spells such words in two different ways. Sometimes they take the digraph oi as choice and voices, and sometimes the digraph ui as join for join. This distinction is a consequence of their ancestral pronunciations in Middle English. The opinion, then, of Crystal about this line, "From forth the fatal loins of these two foes," that there is a pun on loins with lines, does not necessarily have foundation. For his reasoning is that they were both pronounced loins, but from Hart we infer that they were sounded loins and lanes, distinctly, as they are in our own time. To the Strut and goose lexical sets, Crystal generally assigns a sound of He proposes this sound to make words like love and prove rhyme, as they do in Shakespeare. Thus Crystal has love, prov. But we learn from Hart that such words have the quality not of but oo, for he spells them with a u. So in modern English we say goose words with an oo, as prove or move. Gill even distinguishes between love with a short vowel and move with a long one, similarly to their modern English lengths. Furthermore, he even has them rhyme. And this circumstance indicates that words could rhyme in Elizabethan poetry even when they differed in quantity. But Crystal, as a result of his method, has lost all quantities in his midway sound of by which words like move, prove, and doom are considerably clipped. Muv, prov, dum. To words in the face lexical set, Crystal ascribes a quality of air, as fairs, or for name, nam. But when they are pronounced with an a in Middle English, Hart and Gill spell such words with the letter a, also pronounced a. Thus we find in Hart, for name, make, and places, the spellings naam, maak, and places. And Gill has maak, plaas, forsaak, forsake, quaak, quake, etc. Many sonnets, I find, are more pleasing with Hart as our guide here. In the first quatrain of Sonnet 18, for example, we have the rhyme words day, temperate, may, and date, which are line A-B-A-B. In Crystal, they all have an identical rhyme vowel of air. De, temperate, me, and det. Whereas if we assume with Hart that temperate and date are temperat and dat, then we enjoy a more varied scheme of sound. It is also remarkable that in the works of Shakespeare, words like hate and state never rhyme with great, even though Crystal gives to all of them a sound of air, het, stet, gret. And it is difficult to conceive that this is a mere coincidence. To the nurse lexical set, Crystal gives a sound of ah, as tarn for turn. But in Hart and Gill, words in this set are written with various vowels. Thus Hart has turned and nurse, turned and nurse, with a U, merci with an E, and Gill has desert, dessert, with an A. There is no evidence in them for any such universal sound as ah. The merger of words in the nurse lexical set is also said to be a late development in English, only being completed towards the very end of the 18th century. The sound ah often makes an appearance in Crystal's dictionary, as in readings like war and jar for war and jar. But Hart provides us with no evidence that such a sound existed in his day. For the letter A, he provides us with only one possible sound, the ah of the Romance languages, which we shape, says Hart, quote, with wide opening the mouth, as when a man yawneth. War, jar. To the mouth lexical set, Crystal ascribes a sound of O, but I do not think that a schwa is warranted, for in Hart such words are spelled with O-U. Thus Hart writes, mouth. Crystal assigns to the letter R the West Country or American sound, R. But Ben Jonson calls it the dog's letter, as the nurse in Romeo and Juliet calls R the dog's name. And this much more fittingly describes a rolled R, which is like a snarl. So Aubrey reports in his brief lives that Milton pronounced the letter R, quote, very hard, true to its name of littera canina. And I do not conceive how a West Country R can be pronounced hard, whereas a rolled R may be pronounced very hard, as we see in Spanish. Samuel Johnson, writing at so late a date as 1755, describes the letter R as rolled. R, he writes, has the same rough snarling sound as in other tongues. Without a rolled R, certain lines in Shakespeare lose their appropriately harsh effect, as these ones in Lear. Blow, winds, and crack your cheeks. Rage, blow, you cataracts and hurricanos, etc. I am sceptical of the claim of Crystal and others that we must often drop the letter H to be authentically Elizabethan. Undoubtedly, some speakers did often drop it, but both Hart and Gill consistently write the H, and this is a choice that surely ought to be respected. They do not merely write H for the sake of spelling, for they leave it unwritten in words like honour or our. That H was dropped, however, in words like unstressed him or her, I can well believe, both by analogy with modern English, and from the spelling of words like dunghole for dunghill, where an unstressed H is lost. Contrariwise, an H sound is often warranted, at least as an option, where it is missing in Crystal's dictionary. The digraph GH often takes a letter H in the transcripts of Hart, and without this H sound, Shakespeare is at times less effective. A phrase like rough winds, for example, is more pleasing when the GH digraph is sounded, since it is a sort of onomatopoeia. Ruch winds. Enough has now been said to show that the system of crystal ought to be re-evaluated. His work on OP is highly innovative and commendable. But to use spellings and rhymes as our chief source of information, with the phoneticians merely as a supplement, is surely to put the cart before the horse. John Hart, in particular, dedicated his life to creating an accurate record of the pronunciation of his time. And we must not attempt a reconstruction that does not take him into the most serious consideration. What alternative, then, would I advocate for? It would lie outside either the scope of this essay or my own poor knowledge of linguistics to provide anything like an alternative to Crystal's dictionary. But it may still be of use to give an overview of my own preferences for performing Shakespeare in reconstruction, which others are at liberty to take or leave as they see fit. The first point to consider is that any reconstruction must take some account of the great vowel shift. In 1909, Otto Jespersen first identified this famous phenomenon. It is the process by which the long vowels of Middle English became the long vowels of our modern tongue. Thus, Chaucer said beat, and we say bite. He said mate, and we say meat. He said die, and we say day, and so on. To find the long vowel sounds in the time of Shakespeare, then, we must deduce at what stage the great vowel shift then generally was. The scholar who, in my opinion, has given the best account of the great vowel shift is Roger Lass. This is because he bases his account on a deep respect for the work of the Elizabethan phoneticians, especially John Hart, whom he calls, quote, perhaps the most important phonetic source for his period. The following is an overview of Lass's reconstruction. My sources are Phonology and Morphology, in the third volume of the Cambridge History of the English Language, and in A History of the English Language, edited by Hogg and Denison. In practice, of course, pronunciation was not so neatly arranged as this. Some speakers may have used a more advanced, and some a less advanced pronunciation for various words in each category. But the chart does at least provide us with the ability to make a historically informed approximation. Whether we use a pronunciation closer to 1500, 1600, or even 1650, depends on our taste. My own preference, generally, is to use the sounds from 1600. Bait, meat, mate, mat, die, oat, boot, etc. It will be seen that the oi sound of Crystal's system does eventually make an appearance in 1650. According to Lass, A first developed into oi and then into ai. That oi developed into ai appears to be generally accepted by linguists, although Wilde is a dissenting voice, who thinks that a developed straight into ai. Over and above a general overview of the great vowel shift, the Elizabethan phoneticians also offer us great insight. They teach us the pronunciation of many words. They show us variant pronunciations, as that the word my could be pronounced both me and may. And they reveal more advanced pronunciations, which we may take or leave at our pleasure. Thus, even though the transition from met to meet was not complete even by 1650, we find in Hart readings like appear, clean, and read. In this essay, I have spoken exclusively about Hart and Gill as phonetic writers. But there are, of course, many other writers to be learned from also. For words ending in tion and sion, for example, Hart and Gill write sion. But we may prefer to follow the more advanced pronunciation of a writer like Mulcaster, who in such cases writes shan. And Shakespeare himself, as Crystal points out, has luscious for luscious and martial for martial. Lass provides multiple possibilities for pronouncing words like day. An overview of the situation is as follows. For words like day, play, sail, etc., which in Middle English were pronounced I, Hart writes a long letter E, as dare, play. Jesperson was the first to point out the trouble in this. For Hart also writes a long letter E in words like see and seal. Now words like say and see, sail and seal, are distinctly sounded in both Middle and Modern English. So that if Hart's long E was the standard pronunciation, then how did these categories begin separately in sound, then coalesce, and then separate again? The solution proposed by Wolfe is that Hart's long E in words like day was dialectical. She bases this on a complaint of Alexander Gill, that Hart's transcription with the letter E in words like day is a feature of what Gill calls the Mopsy dialect. In agreement with Middle English, Gill always writes such words as I. The conclusion to all this is that we have a choice in our pronunciation of words like day. My own preference is to follow Gill and say die, both for historical and aesthetic reasons. But others may prefer to follow Hart and say de or dare. Lass also gives us a choice of saying words like mate as either mat or, as in Crystal, met. But as Hart, Gill, and the rhymes of Shakespeare all support, for words that were pronounced ah in Middle English, a reading of ah, I prefer mat. There are a couple of points where I disagree with Lass. My first disagreement is with his belief that the short vowels I and U did not yet exist in Shakespeare's day. Thus, in his opinion, words like did and book were pronounced not did and book, but deed and book. His point of view, as he says, is not a widely held one. The usual view is that they existed even in Middle English times. But he bases it on the explicit statement of John Hart that the vowels in his system are qualitatively the same. Thus, if Hart writes D-I-D, then must we not pronounce deed? My answer to this is that Hart appears to have had a slightly looser definition of quality than we do. For Lass interprets the 5 letters of Hart as having the following qualities: A, E, I, O, U. And yet Hart also uses his letters E and O to represent words that have the sounds not of E and O, but E and U. Indeed, he even goes so far as to say that every one of the sounds in his system can be found in the Italian word reputazione. Nor does Hart show any acknowledgement of the fact that the Italian letters E and O have, each of them, 2 sounds. That letter E may be either E or E, and that letter O may be either O or U. The distinction did exist in the Italian of his time. For in 1524, the scholar Trissino had tried to reform Italian spelling by introducing, for the sounds E and O, the letters epsilon and omega. It follows, then, that Hart, who was writing in the infancy of phonetics, could use one letter to represent what we now regard as 2 different qualities, which he perceived to be the same. And if he was happy to use his letters E and O to signify both E and E, O and U, then why should we forbid that his letters I and U could also represent E and U? Indeed, even when we look forward as far as the 18th century, we find Benjamin Franklin, in his phonetic alphabet, using only one symbol for the vowel of both did, D-I-D, and deed, D-E-E-D. Thus, the Elizabethan short vowels are, in my opinion, A, E, I, O, and U. Short O would eventually lower to O before voiceless fricatives, as in off or cloth. A would eventually change to air, and the sound A would be introduced. But these particular changes were not stabilized until the mid-17th century. I also disagree with Lass on the pronunciation of the schwa. Hickey, summarizing the position of Lass, says that he sees, quote, little evidence for the existence of schwa before the late modern period. But Joan Beale, adds Hickey, is more cautious. Quote, she points out that the prescriptivists refer to what is later schwa as an, quote, obscure U-vowel, which suggests that it was indeed already a schwa in the 18th century. And Hickey goes on to write, quote, spelling variations, and not least the loss of inflectional syllables already in the early Middle English period, would seem to indicate that short unstressed vowels have had a centralized pronunciation in English for something like 1,000 years. Hart also provides us with evidence that the schwa was pronounced in his time. He appears to signify the sound of the schwa by omitting a letter. Thus he writes, often OFTN, even IVN, article ARTIKL, little LITL, given GIVN, happen HAPN, remember REMEMBR, etc. Sometimes the same word will be written both with a vowel in the schwa position and without one. Thus we have for water both UATR and UATER. For labour both LABR and LABUR. And this variance indicates to me that any unstressed vowel stood for a potential schwa, even when written out in full. Such are my minor disagreements with Lass. But my preference upon the whole would be to reconstruct the speech of Shakespeare's time according to the account of the great vowel shift given in him, with reference to the Elizabethan phoneticians for additional insight. I will conclude by making one last point about the limitations of the OP project itself with respect to authenticity. One danger of performing in a reconstructed pronunciation is that an actor is liable to sacrifice sense for sound. He or she is easily led to concentrate, not on the meaning of the text, but on the mere enunciation of its words. Performance in OP has an important place, and has the ability to give fresh insight into Shakespeare. But we should not lose sight of the fact that the best way to shed light on Shakespeare is a meaningful delivery of his language. The eternal performances of Garrick and Barry, Kean and Siddons, were spoken in the pronunciation, not of another time, but their own time. And the greatest accomplishment for an actor of Shakespeare is not the reproduction of certain vowels and consonants, but intelligent interpretation and passion.